All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Hybrix cultivation system. Today, we're going to be talking about the soil food web, which I'm sure that you've probably heard that term at this point. So today, we're going to talk in more detail about what the soil food web is and try to give you a really good sense of it, especially from a practical sense, how this applies to your work as a grower. This will probably seem the most theoretical of our lessons, even though we will be talking about real living organisms, but it is not, a lot of what we're going to be talking about here is not something that you're going to see on a day-to-day basis. A lot of it is microscopic, but it's important, very important, to understand how the soil food web works, the implications of it, because this is the really the foundation for looking at the earth element of your grow and how your soil is going to help your plants grow without needing to use fertilizers and eventually without needing to use pesticides, because we're going to prevent pests with having high bricks content. So, the soil food web concept, as you may know, originated with Dr. Elaine Ingham, who is a soil scientist. I actually had a great opportunity to interview her recently about her story, and it's a really fascinating story. Besides all the science she's come up with, she's got a really interesting background. She was going to graduate school, actually getting her PhD back in the late 1970s, and she just kind of stumbled across this idea of studying the organisms in the soil. You know, back then, a lot of agronomists and agricultural scientists were actually not very concerned with organisms in the soil. In fact, it was the general perspective that they didn't do anything, and soil was really all about chemistry. It was just looked at from the perspective of chemistry. And she was involved in a research project to using some cutting edge techniques to start identifying the life that was in the soil. And as she did that, starting out, I believe, with fungi, she realized that same technique could be used to identify bacteria, and then protozoa, and then nematodes, and all of a sudden she realized, hey, wait a second, there's this whole web of life going on in the soil here, and nobody's really paying any attention to it. And so there were other scientists working on some of these same things at the time, but she was really one of the pioneers to start identifying actually what is the life that's in the soil and what is it doing in the soil and why could it be important to plant growth. And now we understand that it's actually extremely important to plant growth. In fact, it's a huge piece that agriculture has been missing for probably at least 100 years. It was about 150 years ago that scientists identified nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium as the leading macronutrients that plants need for growth. But what we've been missing since then is the role that microorganisms play in getting those nutrients to the plant. We didn't understand this before. And so when we're learning to grow using the soil food web, there's really a paradigm shift that needs to take place. If you're experienced in growing with hydroponic or aeroponic methods, or even what I like to call conventional organic, which really is just the idea of using organic nutrients but still following conventional agricultural practices, which, as we're going to see, are wrong in a lot of ways, and we're actually just going to turn all of that on its head. So there's really a paradigm shift that has to happen, and a big part of that paradigm shift is letting go of control. So a lot of growers have this instinct that they want to understand exactly what nutrients the plant needs at what time and precisely control how much nutrients they're feeding to the plant to give it the optimal growth and maybe even to get it to grow in a way that's beneficial to them as the grower, to express certain terpenes or cannabinoids, or even just to grow bigger fruits or whatever it might be. When growing with the soil food web, what we have to understand is that the microbes and the plants now are completely in control. In fact, ultimately, it's really the plants that are in control. The plants, just like us, know what they need to eat. They know what nutrients they need, and the microbes in the soil are the vehicle for them to get those nutrients. Without the microbial life in the soil, the plant's roots are going to be looking around, where's my food, where's my food? And without the microbes, the only way for them to get food is to be spoon-fed food in the form of fertilizers by us. But the problem is, as people, we can't really communicate with the plants. At least most of us can't communicate with the plants, and we don't actually know exactly what they need at exactly the right time. That may change, on an hour-to-hour basis. It may change overnight while we're sleeping and we're not there to tend to the plants. So we have to give up this idea that we're going to control the nutrients being fed to the plants and that we even know exactly what nutrients the plant needs at what time. Another big part of this paradigm shift is realizing that there's really no such thing as a bad microbe or even a bad insect or a bad fungus. We have this idea that there are certain organisms that are bad because they might attack the plant. But really, we're going to shift that thinking in a way so that what we start to see is that there's just an ecosystem here. And if we have a balanced ecosystem, even the bad guys are actually beneficial to the overall ecosystem, and we want to have them there. And so our goal here, again, just like with the 4 elements, is to achieve balance and to achieve maximum diversity, maximum biodiversity. A healthy ecosystem is going to have a diversity of living organisms. And so when we start to change our perspective and to focus on these ideas, this is how we start to focus on having a soil health diet, moving away from a fertilizer diet, as we can see here, that's dominant in feeding nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Probably a lot of growers now are considering, oh yeah, I need some micronutrients as well, and maybe I need some microbes too. But the dominant thinking is still about giving fertilizers. NPK, that 444, 333, whatever those 3 numbers are. And we have to understand those 3 numbers are not by any means the most important thing. In fact, in our method of growing, we don't even really care. We don't try to buy products that have those 3 numbers on them. We try to stay away from those products because ultimately they're going to salt our soil. And as we know, salt is bad for living organisms. So now we're really getting to the heart of the matter here. This is where it all happens. This is what University of Washington professor David Montgomery likes to call the biological bazaar. This is the rhizosphere. It's the zone in the soil around the plant's roots. And this is where the plants and the microbes exchange nutrients. And so we want to have a thriving biological bazaar with all kinds of things being exchanged by different organisms in the soil. And if we have that thriving biological bazaar, just like the market, you've probably heard of the invisible hand and how the invisible hand just kind of makes the market work. It's actually kind of the same concept in the soil here. The marketplace between the microbes and the plant is going to work if we just step back, if we just give it some of the right elements and then just step back and let it do its thing. It's going to do all the work of getting nutrients to the plant for us. So what's happening here specifically is the plants are actually in the process of photosynthesis. They are producing sugars, which are called, in this context, exudates. They're exudates because that X means out of. And so they're taking these sugars, they're pushing them out of their roots into the soil to feed primarily bacteria and fungi. And in fact, the plants are making different varieties of sugars that are designed to feed different varieties of bacteria and fungi. Because again, the plants are very intelligent. They know exactly what nutrients they need and therefore exactly which species of bacteria and fungi they need to feed in order to get what they need. Actually, the same thing happens when the plant detects some sort of invading parasitic organism, whether it's a parasitic fungi or a nematode or bacteria or whatever. When the plant detects that in the soil, it will put out exudates to attract the predators and the protectors, the microbes that will protect the plant from those parasitic organisms. And if there's a strong enough ecosystem there and those microbes are present, they will fight off those parasites. So, it might seem like we're spending a lot of time on this, but this is probably, if you could take maybe one thing away from this course, this is potentially the most important thing, is to understand this relationship between the plants and the microbes. This is the cutting edge science that we didn't really realize until 20 years ago. I mean, Elaine Ingham started to discover this about 40 years ago, but it didn't really come into the general scientific understanding until about 20 or 30 years ago, and it's just now finally making its way into agriculture and into hydro stores and garden supply stores, because people are finally being educated and realizing that, oh, this is the missing piece of the science that we've been missing. And all these fertilizers focus on NPK was actually the wrong kind of thinking this whole time. And so just to finish up this explanation, if it didn't seem complete there, the plants are putting out exudates to the bacteria and the fungi, and the bacteria and the fungi are bringing those nutrients to the plant. They can bring the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, the calcium, the magnesium, the sulfur, the iron, whatever the nutrients are, the bacteria and the fungi can bring it to the plant. The fungi have these, the mycorrhizal fungi specifically, have these hyphae that they grow in the soil, and they essentially extend the roots of the plants out into the far reaches of the soil where they can find nutrients that might not be available right around the plant roots, but that are further out in the soil. And the bacteria can move these nutrients too, but mainly it gets moved through a different mechanism. Bacteria, because they're at the bottom of the food chain, are getting eaten all the time, and then those organisms that eat the bacteria are moving closer to the roots and making those nutrients bioavailable to the plant. We'll get into that a little more later. But all of the nutrients are ultimately made bioavailable to the plant through microbes. And in fact, a way that the soil stores a lot of its nutrients is literally in the bodies of these microbes. So bacteria and fungi and protozoa and nematodes are full of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium and magnesium and all the other nutrients, and they're being stored in there. And this is one of the problems that we'll get into in another lesson with conventional soil tests, is that they miss this whole picture. They don't detect the nutrients that are in the life in the soil. They only detect the immediately available nutrients in the form of fertilizers or potentially other non-immobilized nutrients. So there's a whole other picture that sometimes we're missing here. So now we zoom back a bit. We were talking a lot about bacteria and fungi there, and now we can see the whole soil food web. The bacteria in a sense are, if we think of this as a food chain, the bacteria in a lot of ways are at the bottom of the food chain, although it's called the soil food web because there's complex relationships here, and it's not clearly just a hierarchy. Although the bacteria, if we were to say there's a hierarchy, the bacteria are closer to the bottom, they're closer to the plant itself, and then we have, going up from there, the fungi and the nematodes, and then arthropods, and even animals and birds that come into play in the soil food web closer to the top of the food chain. And all of these organisms are together, eating and excreting and making nutrients available and storing nutrients that are all can be used by the plant. And so it's really important to have this healthy ecosystem. If you're missing a link in the chain, then the soil food web doesn't function quite the way it's supposed to. And this might be the number one reason why some people try this method and then give up, is because they try to start building the soil food web and they don't realize that it does take a little time to build up your soil food web and get it to balance itself out. And they might have run into some initial problems with the balance of their ecosystem, and then say, oh, this doesn't work, I'm having pest problems, and this doesn't work, and then they give up. But if you find ways to deal with maybe those pest problems or nutrient problems in the short term and keep working through it, eventually you're going to have a system that's just working for you, and there's very little work you'll even have to do. So these are really the major groups of organisms that are in the soil food web, and we're going to now go into a little bit more detail about some of these groups. Kind of going to skip over some of the groups because we don't have all the time in the world, and some of these groups, are, I shouldn't say more important than others, but we just, it's maybe a little more important to understand their relationship to the plant. So we're just going to highlight some of these groups here. So the first group to talk about is, of course, bacteria. Bacteria are the most populous organisms in the soil. They're typically the smallest, and in a lot of ways, they're the most resilient. And what that means is, despite all of the horrible things we're doing to soil with conventional agriculture, like tilling and spraying pesticides and spraying herbicides, the bacteria are the ones that tend to stick around the longest. Even in highly degraded soils, you're still going to find bacteria there, because bacteria, they can just live pretty much everywhere. Again, though, just because you have bacteria in your soil doesn't mean that you have a truly living soil with a complete soil food web. And a soil that just has bacteria in it is not going to be very functional as a means for getting nutrients to the plant, and you're probably going to have to apply some fertilizers. So bacteria are just the start of the puzzle. So some of the functions that the bacteria play in the soil, as I mentioned earlier, that biological bazaar, they're one of the primary organisms that is bringing nutrients directly to the plants and exchanging it with the plants. And this is done in a number of ways. Really interestingly, sometimes the plants even consume the bacteria right into their roots. I mean, the bacteria go into their roots and the plants digest the bacteria alive in their roots. So they're literally extracting the nutrients from the bacteria's bodies. And sometimes the plants are just uptaking the excrement of the bacteria. And sometimes the bacteria are getting eaten by other organisms, and then their excrement gets uptaken by the plants. Bacteria can also serve as plant protection. So you may have heard of trichoderma. There's some products out on the market now that include trichoderma and advertise themselves as a biocontrol for controlling certain pathogens. So this is because there are bacteria like trichoderma that will defend the plant from pathogens, especially fungal pathogens. Bacteria are also decomposers. They will eat organic matter and help to break it down, and again, which makes it bioavailable, makes the nutrients bioavailable to the plant. And bacteria then become food for larger organisms. So here are some of the different groups of bacteria, and there are different bacteria have different functions. So you may have heard of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These organisms play a really unique function. There's very few organisms that can take nitrogen out of the air and put it somewhere else. But nitrogen-fixing bacteria are one of those organisms. So you may have heard of nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the context of cover crops. Cover crops are typically legumes that, or at least cover crops that fix nitrogen, are typically legumes that live in symbiosis with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So it's not the cover crop, it's actually the bacteria that are pulling the nitrogen out of the air and putting it into the soil. You can also have free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria that aren't associated with any plant. And in fact, our product Bioflux has some free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria in it. And there's other places you can get those from. As you can see here, there's also groups of bacteria that solubilize phosphorus. So phosphorus is one of those elements that can easily wash out of the soil or get bound up in the soil in a way that it's not available to the plant. So you might have tons of phosphorus in your soil, it's just the plant can't get to it until these phosphorus solubilizing bacteria come along and make that bioavailable to the plant. And then you also have nitrifying bacteria, which are a little different than nitrogen fixing. They actually transform the form of nitrogen in the soil from ammonium to nitrates. Then you have actinomycetes, which actually are almost kind of like a hybrid between bacteria and fungi. but they are often involved in protecting the plant from other parasitic organisms. Lactobacillus bacteria and bacillus bacteria can also do that. They can protect the plant and be biofertilizers. Fluorescent pseudomoniads are often biofertilizers too. And then you might have, as we mentioned, trichoderma and photosynthetic bacteria. And yeasts, photosynthetic bacteria and yeasts are actually major decomposers. And now yeast, that's starting to get a little bit more into the fungal groups. But as you can see, there's all kinds of different bacteria doing different things. And again, the plants are very intelligent and they know when to put out the right exudates to stimulate the right kinds of bacteria for what they need. So, you don't necessarily need to go get a bacillus specific product. If you have a healthy soil ecosystem with many different organisms in there, the bacillus will be present and the plant will be able to access them when they need them. And so one more little plug for Bioflux here. We actually designed Bioflux to be a complete ecosystem of soil microorganisms. And so Bioflux actually contains many of these groups: phosphorus solubilizing bacteria, free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria, actinomycetes, lactobacillus, bacillus, trichoderma, photosynthetic bacteria, yeasts. Most of these groups are present in Bioflux. So now we get to fungi. A lot of people believe that mycorrhizal fungi, and maybe just fungi in general, are some of the most important organisms in the soil. In fact, there's a whole new movie that just came out called Fantastic Fungi that is amazing. You should check it out. It talks all about the functions of fungi in ecosystems. So fungi, unlike bacteria, can actually be visible to the naked eye sometimes in the form of these white strands that you see in this picture here. And you've probably seen something like this before. If you ever picked up leaves decaying on a forest floor and turned them over, they often have this leaf mold underneath them. Mold, in fact, is a form of fungus. So whenever you see those white strands or kind of white fuzz, those are all fungus. And that white fuzzy fungus is typically decomposing organic material. These strands here that kind of look like plant roots, these are mycorrhizal fungi. So fungi are not quite as resilient as bacteria. In fact, they're actually quite a bit more fragile. And this is where really taking care of our soil becomes really important. Because if we disturb our soil too much, the fungal hyphae that you see here, the mycorrhizal fungi, can easily be broken up and their functions no longer available to the plant. So fungi are in kind of what we call, and what Elaine Ingham identified as a higher succession, meaning that there's kind of different layers in the soil food web, as we talked about, and more complexity. As more complexity develops in the soil food web, you start to get more fungal species dominating the soil. And when you have fungally dominant soil, that's when the magic really starts to happen for a lot of plants, especially plants like perennials and trees and shrubs grow really well in fungally dominant soils. But even annual plants like cannabis has been shown to do well in a soil that has more fungi than bacteria. And sometimes, even if that ratio is about 1-to-1, that can be really good for annual plants and for vegetables. Again, the problem with a lot of soils these days is that they're so bacterially dominated that the fungi just barely even have a presence there. So a big part of our goal here is going to be to get towards fungally dominant soils that have lots of fungi growing in them. These mycorrhizal fungi here are kind of like superhighways for nutrients. As I mentioned earlier, they can go out into the soil and essentially extend the roots of the plants, extend them way beyond their normal capacity and bring back nutrients. They can also act as protection for the plants too. And they can even help plants, believe it or not, communicate with each other and tell each other when there is some sort of threat, like a pest or a disease coming. And then fungi, not mycorrhizal fungi, but a different type of fungi, are also huge decomposers of organic material. So here's the different groups of fungi that I've been referring to. So the mycorrhizal fungi, those are the ones that extend the plant's roots and reach out to the soil and bring back nutrients. There's a lot of products out there on the market now that are designed to introduce mycorrhizal fungi into your soil. And that's great. The thing you got to understand, though, is that if you just introduce these mycorrhizae in your first cycle of growing or your first season of growing, it's probably going to be a few months before those mycorrhizal fungi really take off and grow to the extent that you see them growing here. And so if you're just growing for one season and then you're tilling your soil or you're remixing your soil, you're going to destroy those mycorrhizal fungi and all the work that they did in those few months. So unfortunately, a lot of people are just using mycorrhizal products incorrectly. They're adding them, and by the time they start to see the benefit, they're tilling or they're remixing their soil and destroying them. And then saprophytic fungi are the type of fungi that are independent from plants. So mycorrhizal fungi, they form a symbiotic relationship with plants, and in fact, they need the plants just as much as the plants need them. Saprophytic fungi are typically independent of plants. They are the decomposers. So you see down in the bottom here in the middle, the typical mushrooms that you think of are actually just the fruiting body of the saprophytic fungi that is underground decomposing a lot of plant material. And then you can even have symbiotic fungi with the plant besides mycorrhizal fungi like lichen that are actually growing in a really tight relationship with the plant. And of course, you can have parasitic fungi too. A lot of people worry about and deal with fungal parasites. Fusarium is a really common one for cannabis or for tomatoes or for some other plants. Powdery mildew affects many different types of plants. So, and botrytis especially affects wine grapes, but again, many different types of plants. Pythium, root rot is kind of the common word used for some of these fungi that attack the roots. So you can have a lot of different fungal diseases, and people get really concerned about these, and then they use fungicides to get rid of them. But unfortunately, fungi have so many other benefits. When you use those fungicides, you're destroying all these beneficial fungi. So the way to fight parasitic fungi is with other microorganisms that will defend the plant. And this can be bacteria, and it can be other organisms. And also, the fungi can defend the plant as well from other parasites. So here we have this worm-looking thing is a parasitic nematode. And what you see wrapped around it, that thread there, is actually a mycorrhizal fungal hyphae that is defending a plant from this parasitic nematode. And it can go the other way around too. You could have nematodes defending a plant from a parasitic fungus. So this is what I mean when I start to say, we shouldn't really be thinking of certain organisms as good and bad, because they can actually play either role, and we're going to see that even more in a minute. So now we get to kind of the next level of the soil food web, some of the primary predators, and protozoa are a big one. So when I say primary predators, I mean these are kind of the next, maybe higher level of organisms that are preying on and eating a lot of the smaller ones like bacteria. In fact, protozoa primarily eat bacteria, and then they make nutrients in the bacteria available to the plants through their excrement. Protozoa can also eat fungi, and they can even eat nematodes, and they even eat other protozoa. So a lot of these organisms you'll see are just eating each other all over the place, and this is how the soil food web works. So a big thing that the protozoa do in this process of eating all these other organisms is they free up nitrogen. So again, bacteria may have a lot of nitrogen literally fixed up in their bodies, and sometimes the plants can extract that, and sometimes they can't. Sometimes they need a protozoa to eat the bacteria first in order to get that nitrogen available to the plant. Now, you may be taking a lot of notes here and trying to understand all these relationships, but just understand this. You don't necessarily need to memorize all the different roles of these organisms, exactly what they're doing. Really, what we're trying to get you to see here is the importance of having all these organisms present in your soil and having this diversity. And so later we're going to get to practices you can use to let all these organisms proliferate and thrive and balance each other out and eat each other the way they're intended to. So another group of predators is nematodes. Nematodes, like the protozoa, are eating a lot of the other smaller organisms in the soil. They're eating bacteria, they're eating protozoa, they're eating other nematodes, and nematodes can even eat insects and slugs. Now, if you don't know what nematodes are, they are, in fact, they're one of the newer groups in the soil food web that's been discovered. A lot of scientists and gardeners and farmers didn't even know about nematodes until very recently. But nematodes are like these tiny little, typically microscopic worms, although sometimes you can see them with the naked eye. They might look as small as like a short little hair. They're really, really tiny. But they're like these little worms that live in the soil. They're extremely abundant. They're in soils all over the world, almost as abundant as bacteria and fungi. They're everywhere. And a lot of people are only familiar with nematodes because they might know that there are some herbivore nematodes that actually eat living plant material. So these are essentially the parasitic nematodes that attack the roots of the plants. And so if you've ever had a problem with nematodes in your garden, it's because these parasitic nematodes are attacking the roots of your plants. But those type of nematodes only make up about 20% of all nematodes. The other 80% are hugely beneficial. So we don't want to be necessarily killing off nematodes, again, with something like a nemicide. We want to balance our ecosystem to get rid of the nematodes that we don't want. Nematodes, like protozoa, play a huge role in freeing up nitrogen for the plant. So they're extremely important for getting nutrients to the plant and for keeping the whole soil food web functioning. Now, we're going to talk for a second about endophytes. Now, endophytes are not they're not in the same category as nematodes and bacteria and protozoa and fungi. Endophytes, in fact, can be any of these types of microbes. What endophytes means is just endo means inside, and the phyte refers to the organism. So these are organisms that literally live inside the plant. And in this picture here, you can see these are plant cell walls, and you can see some of the little specks and little squiggly things in there. Those are bacteria and nematodes that are living inside the plant. Now, these are not the parasitic type that we were just talking about. These are symbiotic. So an endophyte is symbiotic with the plant. It's living inside the plant, but it has some function that is benefiting the plant. Now, one of the amazing things some of these endophytes can do, and this is really cutting edge, Dr. James White from Rutgers University, who, by the way, speaks on our Science of Cannabinoid Cultivation Academy. Dr. Elaine Ingham also speaks on that series, so if you got that series, go and watch it. Dr. James White is doing some really cutting-edge research right now on endophytes, and just recently discovered a bacteria that can actually attack a parasitic Fusarium fungi and convert that fungi. Essentially, it like takes over the body of the Fusarium and turns it into something that is able to benefit the plant. It essentially it's almost like it's enslaving that Fusarium and saying, do my will, and then taking it back to the plant. And actually that Fusarium is now having a beneficial role for the plant. So again, just totally, throws our conception out the door of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. We think of Fusarium as this horrible disease that attacks the plants. And yet, if we have the right beneficial bacteria present, they can convert that Fusarium to do something beneficial for the plants. And now we're really getting up to the macroscopic level, to the arthropods. These are what you typically think of as insects, although arthropods is actually a broader category than insects. There are so many different types of arthropods, but you probably recognize many of them here. We've got ladybugs and ants and spiders, beetles, butterflies, mites, flies, bees, mosquitoes, caterpillars, and even lobsters and crabs are actually arthropods, but we don't have those in the soil. We have these other ones in the soil, though, and they all play a very important role. Now, you might be familiar with mites because you might have had certain types of mites attacking your plants. And again, there are mites that attack plants, but there are plenty of mites. In fact, we'll talk more about springtail mites later that are very beneficial decomposers for the soil. A lot of these arthropods, actually, one of the main functions that they perform in the soil food web is shredders. They're shredders of organic material. So think leaves and even your mulch, your straw mulch, or that you might be putting down. Or now wood mulch, that's another thing. Really fungi, and I meant to say this earlier, fungi are one of the few organisms that can break down woody material. But the arthropods are breaking down a lot of the other big material, like leaves, stems, and grasses. And they're shredding them into smaller bits so that then the smaller organisms, like the bacteria in the soil food web, can then eat those. Arthropods are also predators. They're predators of nematodes. They're predators of protozoa. They're eating all the other little guys. And as they're crawling around in the soil, because they are larger, they are doing a lot of soil aeration. They're creating little tunnels all over the soil as they crawl through the soil. And this is what allows a lot of the air to come down and reach your roots. So you don't have to do mechanical aeration and drill down to get air to your roots. The arthropods will do that for you. Now, there are some arthropods that will live off of living plant material, but oftentimes they prefer dead plant material, and it's only when there is no dead plant material available that they will go after living plants. So if you're having a problem with one of these eating your living plants, probably means you actually need some more dead organic material in your soil for them to eat. All right, and the last group we're going to talk about today, earthworms. I'm sure you've heard of the benefit of earthworms and earthworm castings especially. Now, earthworms are, people talk about how amazing they are, and really what that gets to is earthworms have really very few, if any, downsides for the soil food web. They're not parasitic. They don't really attack any other organisms. They are predators of bacteria and fungi. That's their main food. They do eat bacteria and fungi, but they're never parasites, and they're not going to attack your plants. And so this is why so many gardeners love earthworms, because you really can't have enough earthworms. You could have earthworms totally taking over and dominating your soil, and it would actually be one of the best things that could happen, because they're just going to eat through all the organic matter that you've got there and turn it into these beautiful worm castings that are super rich in nutrients. In fact, worm castings have way more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and calcium than most people realize. They can really provide great fertilizer for your plants. And the great thing about worm castings is they're not going to burn your plants. You really can't over-apply worm castings. That's one of the amazing things about them. So we'll talk about this later in another lesson. We'll actually have a whole, or at least a pretty substantial part of a lesson dedicated to talking about how we can breed earthworms. And we're going to mix earthworm castings into our soil. Now you might be thinking, oh, well, worm castings are expensive, and they can be a little pricey up front, but just another reason to either make your own, or consider that expense you're paying up front is going to pay dividends for a long time by making your soil really rich and really healthy. Because worm castings, they don't just provide nutrients, they provide tons of microbes. the worms are eating bacteria and fungi, and those bacteria and fungi are also coming out with the worm castings too. So worm castings are going to add all kinds of diverse life to your soil. I was just talking to someone today that was asking whether they should buy pasteurized worm castings or live worm castings, and definitely buy the live worm castings because you want to have that soil life. I would not recommend buying dry worm castings. Dry worm castings are probably going to be devoid of life. So, the earthworms, they are shredding organic material, they're predators of bacteria and fungi. They are also soil aerators, they're creating tubes in the soil as they're moving around. And they also produce compounds that bind the soil together. So you probably, if you ever picked up an earthworm, you might have noticed how it's kind of slimy. Well, that slime is a little bit sticky, and it's helping to stick soil particles together and bind them and contribute to your soil structure. Fungi actually produce these substances as well that help bind the soil together. But earthworms do it too, and so that's just another reason why earthworms are amazing. And one more thing about earthworm castings, when earthworms consume organic material in the soil and then they poop it out in the form of castings, those castings are 50% higher in organic material than when they entered the worm's body. And so what that means is they're just breaking it down to the point where it's getting closer to what we call soil humus, which is really like kind of the holy grail of what you want in your soil. This is like really rich organic matter that's just going to preserve your soil fertility and provide practically endless nutrients to your plants. You know, this is one thing that Elaine Ingham often says, is that all the nutrients your plant needs are usually exist physically in most soils. You know, I mean, it's fairly rare to find a soil that is physically devoid of nutrients that the plant needs. It's just a question of finding those nutrients and making them bioavailable to the plant, and how you make them bioavailable. And worms play a huge role in that. So, how do we create this soil food web? How do we encourage all these organisms to grow and thrive and work together in our soil? Well, as you probably guessed, it's not from buying a high-end, quote, super soil. Super soils typically are packed with lots of nutrients, lots of NPK nutrients, which can be good for the plant to get it started, but that's not really what creates a healthy soil food web. And in fact, if your super soil is too packed with nutrients, it can actually be detrimental. Because again, that nutrients, when it's available to the plants, is in salt form, and salt is not good for life. So, should you buy a living soil mix? Well, you can. There are soil mixes that are definitely good to start out with, but you can't really buy all of the life that's in your soil. You can buy a soil that probably has a lot of bacteria in it. Maybe it even has some nematodes, and you could buy soil that has mycorrhizal spores in it. So that's a good foundation, good place to start, but it's going to take time and nurturing of that soil to grow those mycorrhizal fungi and to grow that ecosystem. So, if someone's advertising something as a living soil, you can't really buy a living soil. You can buy a good mix that will give you a good foundation, and in fact, we're going to have a recommendation for exactly what that mix should look like, but it's just a starting place. And finally, you don't create a soil ecosystem just through mycorrhizal inoculants and adding microbial products, although, again, those can help. And in fact, we offer some microbial products that can help you jumpstart that soil ecosystem, like Bioflux and Terraflux. But it's just the beginning. It's just jumpstarting it. What we're going to find is that really you need regenerative practices to build the soil food web. And in the next lesson, we will lay out what those regenerative practices are that are going to help you build the soil ecosystem. So, just to leave you with a few additional resources that could be helpful, we've just kind of given a quick really a relatively quick overview of the soil food web in this lesson. And this should give you all the information that you need. However, if you want to understand the soil food web in a lot more depth, this Teaming With series by Jeff Lowenfels, starting with Teaming with Microbes, is a really great resource if you want to understand how the soil food web works in a lot more detail. And if you don't feel like you have the time to read a whole book or a whole 3 books, then I highly recommend this documentary, The Symphony of the Soil. There's a lot of movies, documentaries that have come out recently actually about topics related to the soil. The Fantastic Fungi and Kiss the Ground is another great one. But Symphony of the Soil came out 10, 15 years ago and really does a great job of describing in depth this whole kind of soil ecosystem and the importance of biology and organic matter in your soil. So that's a 1.5, 2-hour movie that you can sit through pretty quickly. And then finally, if you got this course, you may have also purchased the Science of Cannabinoid Cultivation Academy from us. And by the way, for anybody growing something besides cannabis, we called it the Science of Cannabinoid Cultivation Academy, but really 90% of what's in there applies to cultivating all plants. There is some really great cannabis-specific info in there, but as a vegetable grower, you could watch this too and get a ton from it. Again, we have really in-depth interviews with people like James White and Dr. Elaine Ingham and Leighton Morrison, and some really advanced regenerative farmers like Dragonfly Earth Medicine and Joshua Steensland and Kevin Jodrey and many others. So there's, I believe, 16 experts in total. It's 36 hours of videos. It's a lot, but if you start to go through that, you're gonna get a lot of in-depth info about this and really learn it in a way that you can't really learn it anywhere else. Honestly, this is one of the most in-depth archives of videos of these experts talking about these topics. So that's the end of our lesson, and as I said, next lesson we're going to talk about the regenerative practices that you use to build and regenerate. If you're working with a native soil that's degraded, you can regenerate that soil, or if you're working with a soil mix, you can build a soil food web. So we will see you in the next lesson.